Hi everyone, I'm Cedric from Promyze. In this video, I will show you how to contribute to the hub of best practices by using Promyze. So in this video, we'll show you how to create your account on Promyze, how to set up the plugins, which are quite useful to create best practices with Promyze. We'll see how to create and suggest some best practices, mainly using our plugins. We'll show you how to validate and document your best practices in the Promyze web applications, how you can build your catalog on best practices and then upload it to the hub. If you already have done some of the steps, you can just go through the video and just go to the chapter you want. So to create an account, it's very simple. You just go on promyze.com and you can click on this button on the right top corner on the screen called Launch Promyze, and you will just be redirected to this web page where you can either log in if you already have an account or either create your account. Just need your email address and you will receive a confirmation code. Just input it and you will start creating your organization on Promyze. Write your email address, just wait for the registration code, and now you can just pick your subdomain in Promyze, which is basically your organization name. So call it whatever you want. Okay, so quite simple. So you will just have this screen. So as you can see, the first step is to create a space. A space is just a place in Promyze where you will put all your best practices you have created. So let's just write space name for your personal space. We'll call it just personal space. As you're probably alone to use Promyze, just pick the name you want. If you have a team, you will be able to invite in users after this creation. So now you have created your personal space. As you can see, you have a craft workshop which is running, but still no contribution, no best practices. It's quite normal because you've just started using Promyze. So the first step is to contribute to the platform so that you can create your first best practices. So the first step to do is to pick up some plugins, because this is currently the easiest way to create best practices in Promyze. So just click on your avatar on the right top corner, the plugins sections. You will go on this page. As you can see, this is a dedicated page for our plugins, so you can just start using our API key, but first of all, you will need to set up plugins. As you can see, we provide integration for Visual Studio, VS Code, or the JetBrains suite, and also Eclipse. And as well for web browsers, you will be able to use these plugins for code reviews, basically. So this plugin, let's take an example with VS Code. Once you have set up the plugin, you can just click on the Manage button, Settings, just look for Promyze, and here we have to put your API key. And as you've probably seen, you have this API key available in your web page. Just copy-paste this API key in your VS Code or the IDE you are using. So to set up and plug it is quite simple. Just use the marketplace of your favorite IDE. For instance, in VS Code, you just write Promyze, search for it, and you will be able to quickly install the plugin. If you have set up the plugin, you can just click on the Manage button, Settings, just look for Promyze, and here we have to put your API key. And as you've probably seen, you have this API key available in your web page. Just copy-paste this API key in your VS Code or the IDE you are using. Once you've done it, you're ready to use Promyze in your IDE. Set up your plugin, you can start creating your best coding practices. So just reminder, with Promyze we can create all categories of best practices, going through clean code rules, design, architecture, or any rules or best practices related to a programming language or a framework. But we can also talk about security, performance, accessibility, green IT, whatever you want. So just be aware that you can create best practices on any topic you want. In this example, I will just show simple clean code rules, and just so that you can understand how to create best practices with Promyze. So this is very simple. Once you have identified in your source code something which is related to a best practice which is follow or not, So let's see an example here with this snippet of code where the problem I've identified is that we are using a double negation. As you can see, we're using this Boolean operator combined with a function called is not active. And this makes the source code quite hard to understand. In my opinion, we should better use something like if is user is active, for instance. So what I can do is just select this snippet of code, right click, and now you will find this Promyze extension. Just select identify new practice. So either this is negative or positive means whether this source code follows or not a best practices. In my case, this does not follow a best practices, so I will just mark it as a negative example. And now you will see it prompted on the top of the screen the name of the practices I should create. So in my case, I will just name it avoid negative conditionals. I can write a description, but I can also do it later in Promyze. So in my case, I will do it later in Promyze. I will just show you after. Just type enter. I can add some categories, so this is very important to to add some keywords to your best practices. So in my case, I would just create clean code category, and that's it. I send it to Promyze. You can also install our extensions for web browser, such as Chrome, Google Chrome, such as Google. So you can also set up our plugins for web browser, such as Google Chrome, Firefox, Edge, or Opera. And the idea is to use these plugins on pull or merge requests on GitLab, GitHub, Azure DevOps, and also Bitbucket. And the way you can contribute to Promyze is quite simple. If you are reviewing some source code and just want to write a comment which refers to best practices which could be followed or not, you can just write your comments and just click on this button that is available thanks to the extensions and just create a best practices. So the problem here is that we are using this date manipulation framework called Moment, and we are using this framework directly in our controller in AngularJS, and this is not a great way to do in our project. We should better use something called that formatter service. So this is just an example of best practices, but just imagine that your best practices to follow is this one, to manipulate dates. So just click then on identify a Promyze practice, and you can just create a new practice. In the same way, you can also add some description, but in our case, we just add a category, which is kind of hashtag. You can add to some best practices. And in the same way, you have these two position, positive or negative example. In this way, it's more negative example. Okay, just an illustration on how you can use also the plugins for web browser to contribute in Promyze. So the way it works with Promyze is quite simple. We have set up this concept of craft workshop, which is a new technical session dedicated to software developers teams, where they can discuss their best practices and they will use Promyze as a support. Okay, because during a workshop you will review all contributions made by each developer in your team. And the idea will be to discuss all contributions together and decide whether you do agree or not with such or such practices. Maybe you are alone using Promyze, so what you can do is exactly the same way. So just click anytime you want, anytime you have new best practices on this button, Practices Details. You will see all the contributions you made. You can just now click on the button Launch the workshop. So just simulate now a collective workshop, okay? Imagine you are with your team. So in this step, you will just review all your contribution you made using our plugins. What you can see is the source code you sent in Promyze, okay? And Promyze provides a focus where you have identified your best practices, okay? So now what you can do is quite simple. You can just click on this button, validate the practice. Then you will have also to validate the example, because in Promyze you can create best practices and you will need to add some examples and counter examples of best practices. So you need to make sure that even if you have created the best practices, the examples, the associated examples are relevant. This is also quite important to document your best practices. So once you have validated your best practices, you can just open it or click on this button, Edit Practice. And then you will just have this text editor so that you can add more content, more description, so that we can better understand what the idea of your best practices. Feel free also to give any link, any documentation, external documentation that could provide any assistance to the readers of the best practices. So it's also important to take time to document your practice so that it will improve also the quality of the rules that are available on the hub. Use the automatic suggestion algorithm so that you can tell to Promyze how to recognize whether a best practice is followed or not. So you can either use keywords or also use some regular expressions. And you can also use either positive or negative ways to recognize whether a practice is followed or not. So that's how you can validate your new practices in Promyze. So just use this step to review all the practices you've created. So once you have created all your best practices, you will find them in the menu All Practices, right there. And you will just have all your list of best practices. And as you can see, we can just see the categories of best practices you have created. So once you are satisfied with your set of best practices, you can just pick some of them and prepare it to send on the hub. And to do this is quite simple. You will just have to click on this catalog menu, My Catalog, and the idea is to create a catalog of best practices. So this is kind of a bundle of best practices, and then you will just put some best practices in there, export a catalog, and upload it to the hub. Click on this page, create a new catalog. Just write your catalog name. So in my example, I will assume that I will have a catalog of clinical rules. And quite important, you can spend some time to just write a description of your catalog, which just to describe to anyone which kind of best practices you will put in your catalog. And then you will have to just select some of your best practices you want to put in your catalog, just by clicking on this button right there. And once you are satisfied with the list, just click here in this button, Save. So once your catalog is ready, you can just click on it. And now you will click on this button right there, as you can see, Download Catalog. You can choose to include examples or not. So if you click on that, you will export all your source code snippets you have set in Promyze. So just make sure you have the permission to share this source code. I will click on Validate. And it will start downloading a JSON file. Let's download the JSON file. Okay. Our JSON file is ready, so now we are ready to upload it to the hub. So the hub of best practices is available on bestcodingpractices.dev. Okay, so this is a separate platforms which is publicly available for reading, and to submit some best practices, you will have to create your own account. So this is quite simple. As you can see, you have this button right here, Login. So you will just have to create your account, which is a separate account from Promyze. So this is quite simple, and also you can use some social login features, whatever you want. So once you have logged in, you can just click on this button, Import a catalog. And as you can see now, you can click on this button to upload a file. You can also drag and drop any file you want. And that's it. Once you have uploaded your JSON file, it will be available on the hub. As you can see in this example, you have a list of best practices already available on the hub, and you can browse each practices with the associated examples, positive and negative.